Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Gene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftusness and Jared Jeter about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor that publishes every Friday alongside this podcast. So today we'll start off with a brief roundup of all of the major developments happening in each of our global hotspots, including the Middle East, Indo-Pacific, and Russia-Ukraine, as well as take a quick look at some developments out of the US and Brazil. We'll then follow up with a discussion about the anatomy of modern conflicts, including tying in the war in Iran, as well as the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as some others that can have some parallels around these issues. But before that, let's jump into our roundup. So Andrew, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Thanks, Eugene. Quite a bit going on, so let's get right into it with the Middle East, where we saw a trend towards the military escalation scenario. We'll get into a lot of this during our discussion here in a few minutes, but what I want to make sure that people walk away with is that President Trump formally notified Congress that he was resuming offensive operations against Iran on July 14th. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. resumed a naval blockade of Iranian ports throughout the Strait of Hormuz. Both Iran and the U.S. currently claim to have full control of the strait. The U.S. has been carrying out an intensified series of strikes inside Iran over the course of this past week, both in the number, and by intensified I mean both the number of strikes that they're carrying out, their impact on the ground, and their geographic scope within Iran itself. It's a significant shift from the baseline that we have observed since the June 17th MOU. In response, of course, Iran has conducted a series of attacks against Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan, all countries that host U.S. armed forces, and they have also threatened to deny maritime commercial access to the Red Sea. Now, at the same time, Lebanon and Israel wrapped up another round of talks mediated by the U.S., this time in Rome instead of Washington. Perhaps more on that in a bit. And then finally, we saw escalation this week in Yemen. Long story short, there was a bombing of the international airport in Sana'a. The Yemeni Houthi rebel group attributed the attack to Saudi Arabia and threatened significant retaliation against the kingdom, while the internationally recognized government of Yemen has claimed direct responsibility for the attack, saying it carried it out in order to prevent an Iranian plane from landing on the airstrip. Turning now to Europe, where we saw transatlantic relations in the Russia-Ukraine war trend towards the hybrid scenario. Ukraine has been intensifying its strike campaign primarily against energy targets and maritime shipping routes around Russian-occupied Crimea, as well as against Russian shadow fleet vessels primarily in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. In response to these increased attacks, Russia has conducted a series of strikes against the Ukraine's main port city of Odessa, right there on the Black Sea. Now, interesting political news in Ukraine this week. Mass protests have broken out in Kyiv and other cities across the country following the dismissal by Zelenskyy of his defense chief, Ukraine's defense minister Fedorov. Fedorov was very popular amongst the public in Ukraine, and there has been a swift political backlash for the Ukrainian president. Over in D.C., a bipartisan group of U.S. senators is moving forward with legislation that will see new sanctions and tariffs placed on top importers of Russian oil and gas. And then in Europe, we are seeing a warning from Baltic and NATO states, but primarily in the Baltics, warning of Russian plans to conduct an intensified sabotage campaign against infrastructure in Latvia, Lithuania, and a number of other NATO countries. And then finally, on the diplomatic front, or perhaps the lack thereof, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that there is no immediate prospects of Russia re-engaging in the peace process. That's enough for me. Jared, I'll kick it over to you for the latest from the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, we've been seeing some very interesting economic news coming out of Asia right now. In Taiwan, TSMC has announced a new $100 billion investment package into U.S. chip manufacturing and particularly the packaging plants that are being developed on the West Coast and in Arizona. Now, why this is particularly interesting is because the Trump administration has been pretty well known for instituting new tariffs and new sanction packages against certain countries or against certain industries that they want to be able to produce more domestically in the U.S. Taiwan itself has been on the receiving end of quite a few of these sanction packages and tariffs. And as a result of that, as in many countries, you start to see this kind of economic pullback from the United States, interest in more independent economic procedures. However, in Taiwan, they're still continuing to increase their level of investment within the US market. Now, what that says is that Taiwan still views the United States as crucial for not only its own security defense, but also its own economic reliance. As TSMC is still continuing to seek new economic opportunities inside of the United States, and what their real goal is here, what the kind of the main strategy is here, why we haven't seen a economic pullback from the Asian markets as we have seen with like the European markets, is the Asian markets are viewing that the United States as crucial for their economic security in spite of the increased tariffs from the Trump administration. And in addition to that, the security policy of Asia is much more aligned with American interests. They view China as something that they can't really stand up with alone. So, despite the increased economic pressure from the United States, the Asian markets are continuing to cooperate with American investment and with American companies without really seeing too much in the way of slowdown or pullback as we've seen in other markets. It's very important to distinguish like the differences between like the European and Asian markets. Many people have been wondering why Asia responds differently than Europe, and these security concerns and economic reliance is kind of like the main thing to be focusing on here. Then moving to China domestically, China has recently just removed, the Xi Jinping administration has just removed a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, Ma Xingyi, which makes him now the third member to be removed since the beginning of 2025 on corruption charges. Now, Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, which started about 2015, is very well known within China. And while there are, of course, a lot of instances of corruption within the CCP, what we've really been seeing is that Xi Jinping is consolidating power by removing the Jiang Zemin era political appointees to have more of a consolidated power base where pretty much everybody within the Politburo and an increasingly large number of people within the National People's Congress are made up solely from individuals from his faction. We've also seen a substantial purging of people in the military. Now, the Politburo is an institution which very rarely sees change. This is their highest executive authority, where most of the important decisions are made. And under previous administrations, like the Hu Jintao administration, it was very much a kind of ruling council rather than having one person that was particularly powerful. To where under Xi Jinping, we have seen the greatest level of power consolidation since Mao Zedong. And right now, with the third removal in just under a year, which is very unprecedented within Chinese history, we are seeing a continued shift from the Xi Jinping administration towards a much more power consolidated period. Now, while this has been going on for a while, this shift has been particularly rapid in the last couple of years. We've seen a huge number of people, particularly in the military, also be purged. So this now third removal, this unprecedented third removal, really is signifying that China is moving towards a much, much more consolidated and power centralized type of institution rather than just having kind of an oligarchic collective, as was done under the Jiang Zemin and Deng Xiaoping periods. So we're seeing a lot of movement out of China. They recently, of course, also just released their GDP numbers, which show a considerably lower amount of growth than has been previously reported. So China is also feeling the heat from many of these different global shifts, particularly from the Iran war and different trade slowdowns, still recovering from COVID, of course. So in China, we've seen a lot of movement.
Got it. Thanks, Jared and Andrew. So that wraps up our briefing portion of the podcast. And let's now turn into our more long form discussion, where this week we'll actually be discussing a lot of the elements that you both covered in the briefing, particularly on the U.S.-Iran war, but really looking at it from a kind of a higher level perspective and how this war has been really fitting in within the anatomy of modern conflicts, something that applies not only to the U.S.-Iran conflict, but actually all of the global hotspots that we cover. So I just wanted to introduce a few elements here that I think may be interesting to kind of discuss here and look at the prism of these conflicts. One is that they are becoming increasingly prolonged in nature, meaning that they are lasting quite a long time, going beyond weeks or months as they are originally set out to do, to years and sometimes even decades. That's been certainly the case, for example, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which we'll get into in just a moment. And also how these conflicts have now tended to vacillate between war and peace, meaning that they neither achieve full-scale peace nor a sustained full-scale war, and there's a lot of gray zone activity that takes place. Another feature is that these conflicts tend to become increasingly interconnected. And what I mean by that is that it draws in multiple players, not only the direct warring countries or even regional players, but increasingly global players as well, and one that intersects with other theaters and other conflicts. And then finally, that they take on this increasingly hybrid dimension, and we've been seeing this in a number of different theaters, which means that not only direct military targets are dominate the war, but in some cases, infrastructure, energy, pipelines, roads, rail, things of that nature are now increasingly part of the war dynamics. And associated with that, we see some significant global trade and supply chain implications from those conflicts. So maybe just to kind of start off, and I think one of the key hotspots that we cover, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, may be a good starting point from the standpoint that this is a conflict that has been going on for well over a decade now. So this war did not just start in 2022 when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but really goes back to 2014, which is when we saw the initial period following the Euromaidan revolution in Kiev. That's when Russia intervened and annexed Crimea, started the separatist rebellion in eastern Ukraine, and now, 12 years later, that fighting is still happening. But over the course of these, dozen or so years, there's been periods of escalation, certainly, 2022 being the most notable, of course, but also de-escalation as, various players have led diplomatic efforts where there's been efforts to achieve a ceasefire or a peace agreement, and some progress will be made, but it hasn't kind of had that clear, sustainable peace deal. That in part is driven by this, phenomenon that I mentioned earlier of the involvement of multiple players in this conflict. So, for example, in Russia-Ukraine, you obviously have the U.S. and European countries or NATO countries as being key sort of influential players, backing Ukraine. But we've also seen how over the course of the last decade or so, more and more players have made their presence felt in this conflict. So, for example, from the Middle East, we've seen countries like Turkey, like the Gulf states, play an important mediating role between Russia and Ukraine. Or, as in the case of Iran, you're actually directly supporting one of the warring parties, providing Russia with drones and things of that nature. It goes even beyond that into the Indo-Pacific theater. So China has become an important country, both to mediate, but more so to provide Russia with a lot of indirect support, or in the case of North Korea, a direct intervention in the conflict by basically joining Russian troops to fight the Ukrainians on the battlefield. And of course, looking at the global implications, we saw how the start of the conflict going back to 2014 and especially in 2022, how that had a lot of disruption to global trade, and particularly for things like grain supplies, which both Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of, and most significantly in terms of redrawing global energy flows. So that how that's disrupted Russian energy exports to Europe, and really redirected Russian energy flows to countries like China or India, how sanctions and restrictions out of the US and Europe have further accelerated those shifts. So yeah, we see something that starts, in a very kind of specific and local geographic area, and one that kind of broadens out over time. And I think in part that's what it's made, finding that full-scale peace or full-scale resolution so difficult, because you just have so many different players with so many different objectives and constraints that you kind of oscillate, between this neither full-scale war, neither full-scale peace, but somewhere in between. And so with that, I wanted to kind of introduce and discuss the Iran war and perhaps even touch on some other conflicts within the Middle East in that context. And Andrew, I was wondering if you could maybe, add some of your thoughts here in terms of how those different dynamics apply. Obviously, these will be applied in different ways with each theater, but I think now that we're in, month 5 or so of the Iran conflict, which was meant to only last a few weeks, right? At least according to the Trump administration, we've got a lot of players. We've got, clearly global implications. So, looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of places we could jump in. I think that the way we discuss these conflicts and these wars are interesting. So in the case of the U.S. Israeli war with Iran, for example, the Iran war, so-called, as the media refers to it, began on February 28th, right? But I would argue that the U.S. has been in a perpetual state of conflict with Iran, at least since the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And similar to the points you just made about the war between Russia and Ukraine, we have seen that at different levels of intensity, most often below the threshold of armed conflict up until, of course, February 28th. But, if these things are grabbing the public's attention now for obvious reasons, but if you have been paying very close attention for the last several years, I mean, the U.S. has been in a state of, I guess you could say, indirect conflict with Iran in Syria, sometimes in a direct way as well, just not at a very high level of intensity such as we're seeing right now. So with the Iran war in the state that it exists right now, that appears to be a departure from the norm, right? But from another perspective, it's not so much a departure so much as an escalation from, I guess you could say, like a misunderstood status quo between the U.S. and Iran.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And actually, there's, I think, another parallel here with the Russia-Ukraine conflict in that, while we had this dramatic, escalation of sorts, starting in February 28th, as you mentioned, with the U.S. and Israel, launching that full-scale bombing campaign of Iran. I mean, there were many precursors and even, military activity going back a couple of years just in this theater alone, not including, other theaters that you mentioned like Syria. We could also look at Gaza, Lebanon in that vein as well, right? But we did see, the start of military activity going back to 2024 with some limited, direct strikes between Israel and Iran. Then we had 2025 where that picked up again. And then, of course, the 2026, full-scale campaign, which now, we did enter into a de-escalatory period, right, where, there was an MOU signed between the U.S. and Iran, but now we're kind of picking back up in terms of that activity as well. I think it's important maybe to bring in, why we're in this state where it's more difficult to achieve these, whether it's that full-scale resolution or a sustained level of fighting, akin to what we saw, for example, in more kind of global kinetic conflicts like World War II, for example. So I like to think in terms of the guardrails on both sides, in a sense. So why it's difficult to achieve the full-scale peace? Well, part of that is the number of players that I mentioned, right? The interconnected nature. Certainly with a war like Iran, there's so many different players involved. You have the regional actors, obviously US, Israel, and Iran, but also the Gulf states. You've got Russia and China and other countries that are trying to influence, and each has their own objectives, right? But on the other hand, there's also some padding room, not to say that it's impossible, but why we're unlikely, at least in my view, to see a full-scale resumption of military activity akin to what we saw at end of February or throughout March, at least for a sustained period, which is that this is a conflict with global implications, right? Strait of Hormuz being a key vital energy choke point, 20% of global oil and natural gas supplies are flowing there. And so we've seen the global economic impact, which constrains both Iran, but also the US in terms of how long that they can keep this going to those, really heightened levels, right? So I think it's probably not a coincidence that we're seeing, when things quiet down, when there's some diplomatic activity, happening, and then oil prices tend to go down or energy prices tend to go down, then the room for maneuver, I think, from both sides tends to go up, and they are a little bit more, I guess, assertive. However, on the flip side, when things really get disrupted and the Strait of Hormuz is completely blocked, then both sides, or really all sides, feel the pinch, and then we see kind of a reversion back to some kind of talking or some kind of diplomacy. Again, not a full-scale peace, but also the full-scale war. And that's really kind of the environment that we've been in for the past few months, and one that I don't anticipate changing substantially in the future. But Jared, if you want to weigh in here as well.
Yeah, just like what you were saying about the difficulty of being able to definitively end this conflict. One of the kind of primary issues here is that America, in particular, is being pulled in several different directions because the intention of Israel, the stated goal of Israel, is to be able to establish much more of kind of a homogenous control over this area. They do not necessarily want the war to end in the same way that the United States does, but America is constrained by much more immediate economic concerns. America is obviously very concerned. The Trump administration is very concerned with its declining popularity in the face of the economic contraction that has happened as a result of the Iran war and the rising cost of living. But America is trying to kind of balance its relationship with Israel that does not seem to have as much of an immediate interest in seeing the war end with its own domestic concerns. And then on the Iranian side, the Iranian government, now being made up of considerably more hardline individuals than was previous, they now have to be able to kind of justify their own existence. If they're seen making a sign of kind of capitulatory uh, peace agreement with the United States, that might threaten their government's very survival. So they have their own face-saving interests that they need to be able to establish to maintain their own survival. And that's kind of a lot of the main factors that we're seeing in like the extreme difficulty in being able to definitively end this with something that everyone can kind of walk away with a win.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Jared. And actually, kind of on this note that you've been discussing, I think it's worth bringing up here a third global hotspot that we cover frequently, which is the Indo-Pacific. So here we pull in U.S.-China dynamics, but also other related players like Taiwan, Japan, and so forth. And here, this is a theater that clearly does not have the type of ongoing, major military or kinetic conflict like we're seeing in or conflicts like we're seeing in the Middle East and in Russia, Ukraine, but we have seen a lot of the same kind of underlying dynamics of geopolitical competition, of even in some cases security skirmishes around areas like the South China Sea, for example. And so here it might be kind of worth applying the same lens, both in terms of the interconnectedness of this theater, the multiple players, and perhaps most importantly, the global implications, which arguably in the Indo-Pacific could have even more if we do see it raised to that level of kinetic military activity because of the concentration of global trade, of the technology sectors, things like semiconductors, what that would mean for the world, and even below that kinetic line, the hybrid dimension that we're seeing, how we're already seeing that take place. So curious to hear your thoughts within this theater, Jared.
Yeah, over the last year or so, we've been seeing a slow kind of morphing of a new security dynamic within the area. The major constraint that everyone is trying to deal with is much like in the Middle East, the kind of competing interests between different allied blocs. The American allied Asian states, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they are all increasingly becoming much more hawkish about their concerns over China. Particularly when you see comments made by the new Japanese PM Sanae Takaichi. She has a very well established reputation of being very hawkish towards China from a military and security apparatus. You've seen a slow kind of burn of Japan becoming more kind of hostile to its own constitutional provision against building up its own military forces. We've seen a lot of movement in Japan recently about wanting to establish a more formal military, moving away from the U.S. established constitutional provisions there. And its dynamic with America is also very complicated because, as mentioned previously, there's been a lot of economic strain, what with the American tariff policy. And these Asian nations are kind of feeling like a good security relationship with the US, but they're also feeling slightly betrayed by the fact that America is now kind of becoming more of a economically isolated. The America First policy is not playing well in Asia, but because they're much more reliant on America for security protection, much more so than the European Union is, they're starting to see they can't really pull away from America. They can't really make the kind of public rebukes of the American first policy as we have seen from like the European Union, as for an example. And then from China's perspective, China right now is actually in the middle of quite a bit of flux from the Iran war itself. China is actually experiencing kind of its own kind of rock and a hard place type of situation in that, of course, China is very happy that America is expending a large amount of its military equipment over there, sending a lot of forces away from Asia. They're happy about that. But China itself is becoming increasingly hurt by this oil embargo. Many states in Asia are, particularly places like the Philippines. And we've received reports that China has already kind of run pretty low on its own strategic reserves, or that there's whispers that they're getting low on that. And it's already affecting rationing, oil rationing, particularly the southern provinces where they're more oil dependent. So yet China is also kind of operating on a position where they're having to kind of manage this relationship on a global thematic scale, and its relationship with its Asian partners has become increasingly strained, particularly with the more U.S. allied states. And we're starting to see kind of the development of rhetoric that is escalatory, as opposed to the more kind of Hu Jintao era of civil compliance.
Yeah, it's a good point in terms of the interconnectedness that you mentioned. So China being impacted by, as you said, the Strait of Hormuz, but also has the ability to shape through its economic power, through its diplomatic power, relationships with Iran and Russia and otherwise those other conflicts itself. It's also worth pointing out, what I mentioned in terms of the prolonged nature of, using the Russia-Ukraine conflict as an example, the conflict in Gaza, which is still ongoing despite its, doesn't get quite as much coverage because of what's happening in Iran. But if we look at the Indo-Pacific, again, not from necessarily a kinetic conflict standpoint, but from a hybrid conflict, thinking about things like the U.S.-China trade tensions, right, or the conflict over trade. I mean, that's going back to the first Trump administration, almost 10 years ago. That's something that it actually increased across administrations from Trump to Biden to now back to the second Trump administration. And as with Russia-Ukraine, as with the Middle East, we do see periods of escalation and of de-escalation within even that, tension or that conflict type of area, right? One that, of course, does bring in a lot of other players. In this case, when China will look to kind of manipulate its relationships or its supply chains with countries like with Russia or Iran, the U.S. leaning on allies like Taiwan, like the Netherlands, Japan to kind of boost its position as well, which shows leverage, but also makes a full scale resolution very difficult to achieve, even as the limitations, the implications of those conflicts also limit how intense or for how long that intensity can last. So, I mean, I feel like this is something that we can discuss in, for multiple episodes, and I'm sure this is going to be a topic that we're going to be revisiting quite a bit, including exploring how this can apply to conflicts in other theaters like Africa or Latin America or South Asia, and really understanding not only the conflicts themselves and where they're heading, but also how they will be impacting all of the players involved. Ultimately, we're in a new normal that everyone, whether you're a government, a state actor, a non-state actor, a business, these are you have to almost get more comfortable with this mushy, gray zone area of these conflicts where, again, not to say that it's impossible, but we're not likely to see a full-scale resolution, whether we're talking about Russia-Ukraine, the U.S.-Iran conflict, or even these trade tensions between the U.S. and China. But that's about all that we have time for this particular discussion. Before we wrap up, Jared, I wanted to throw it back to you to cover any of the other hotspots from this week very briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. Yeah, we've seen some interesting developments in a few different places. Inside the U.S. right now, we have seen the president be firing a lot of key election officials that are going to be managing the midterm elections, which a lot of detractors are calling a blatant attempt at election interference. Between the U.S. and Brazil, the president has recently instituted a 25% tariff increase to all U.S. imports from Brazil, damaging trade there. And from the European Union, we've seen the European Union institute a new ban on the purchase of gold imports from Sudan in an effort to be able to stop providing any type of funding to the belligerent factions inside the country.
Great, thanks. And with that, we'll have to wrap up for today. So just as a reminder for our listeners, if you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for regular updates around the world. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jared. Thank you all for listening, and take care.